we transition over into chapter 23. And here we learn about the feasts of the Lord. So let me start off with reading verse 1 and verse 2. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, The feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocation, these are my feasts. All right, so here is the beginning of the chapter, and we are going to learn more about the feasts. Many of them have already been described in earlier chapters. Here we have all the groupings with their days, the season that they're supposed to be in, and just a more of an understanding of why they are necessary. So we are going to see 7 annual feasts that the people of Israel were commanded to observe and to celebrate. These feasts were given to the people of Israel, not to all of the nations or all of the world. And even as we read, we learn so much about God and about the people from these feasts, but they were given to the people of Israel. And as you go through, you're going to see a major theme is gratitude. It is for the people to remember what God has done and remember God's promises to them and what He will do in the future and how He continues to provide for them and to care for them. So in these feasts, there's celebration and there's also a remembrance of their identity and also the heart of God. So during these days, they would come together as a people, they would worship, there would be food, obviously, there would be sacrifices, and they would spend this time collectively remembering their place in God's heart. Before he begins to outline the feasts, he reminds them about the Sabbath. The 7th day is their Sabbath of solemn rest. Back in Genesis, God created the world in 6 days. On the 7th day, He rested. And then later on, we see Him talking about the Sabbath day. It's in the commandments. They are to take a day to rest. And that is really in honor of God and just to show that they are depending on God to be their source. And God will be the one who will be able to carry them even in their day of rest. So He's reminding them about the Sabbath, and anything you do, the Sabbath comes first. Even when they were building the tabernacle, God, in giving the instructions to Moses, remind them, even as they're getting ready to start, remember the Sabbath, okay? Don't let your work for me, contradict my law to you. So remember the Sabbath, and now He's reminding them again about the importance of that solemn day of rest. Then we get into the feast. So the first feast that is described is Passover. Now, this feast on the Jewish calendar is in the first month, which is known as Nisan. And the Passover is held on the 14th day of Nisan every year. For the Jewish people, the beginning of the day starts in the evening. So twilight is the end of one day and the beginning of the new day. So they go from evening to the next day, not from morning to night, okay? And remember when they were in Egypt and God brought them out, the last plague where there was the death of the firstborn, God told them if they took the blood and put over their doors, then the spirit of death would pass their homes. So they did the sacrifice of a lamb, put the blood on the lintels of the doorposts, and they were spared from that plague. The angel of death would pass over their homes because they were under the blood of the Lamb. And they are to remember that every year. The second feast, all right, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And you'll see that in verses 6 to 8. And this was originally established at the first Passover. And remember, they made the bread, but because they left so quickly, the bread didn't have time to rise. There was no leaven in it. And so this is to be remembered annually as well. And it is in the same month, right, as the first feast. It's going from the 15th day to the 21st day, all right? So some people consider it to be the second part of the Passover, but this is the feast where all of the people of Israel were to gather before Him every year. So with this feast, this is a week-long feast. On the first and the last day, Israel would gather together in sacred assemblies, what God calls a holy convocation. And they were to look at those 2 days as Sabbath days. So they were not to do any customary work on it. So at this time, you're seeing God's calling them to rest, to remember, to reflect, and really to rejoice in his faithfulness to them. Now, the third feast, which is called the First Fruits Feast, or the Feast of the First Fruits, was also around the same time of the other two feasts. Now, this feast, although it's described here, is actually not to be observed until they come into the land of Canaan. They're journeying there. And I have to say this just right here, because for those who are familiar with the account and the children of Israel and how long they spent in the wilderness, remember that was not God's original plan. They end up wandering for a lot longer than they were supposed to because of the rebellion against God. And so in their minds at this time, they were only maybe a couple months away from the promised land. So God is getting them ready, and he gives them this feast so that when they get there, they will be able to observe it. Now, this feast had to do with the celebration of the harvest and giving thanks to God for the harvest. And they were to dedicate the first set of stalks of grain to God. And that was like an anticipation of the greatness of the harvest that would come. Included in this feast was a year-old male lamb with a grain offering and a drink offering. And it was to be celebrated on the day after the Sabbath that ended the Passover and began the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So these first three feasts, which we have the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the First Fruits, they happen very, very close together. There's a period of approximately 9 days. You have three feasts, right? And it's all in the first month of the year. We continue now to the fourth feast, which is called the Feast of Weeks. We also know it as Pentecost. This was 50 days after the Feast of the First Fruits. So now there's some time that is elapsing between the feasts. And Israel was to celebrate the Feast of Weeks, and in some places it's also called the Feast of Ingathering. They were to celebrate it by bringing a new grain offering to the Lord and offering specific sacrifices. Now, when they come together as a people to celebrate this feast, it talks about 2 loaves of bread being waved before the Lord, right? And interestingly, these loaves were actually baked with leaven, right? Which is unusual, but God says to include it. And so they were waved before the Lord and offered on the altar, and there were animal sacrifices, a burnt offering, grain offering, drink offering. And of course, these sacrifices were made at the tabernacle. So it's a holy day for the people. It's a holy gathering for the people. And of course, it's a day of rest, no customary work. The focus is on God. The focus is on what he has done. And the focus is on serving God, honoring God. So no other work should be done at that time. And remember, this happens yearly. So as he's outlining this to Moses, God also reminds Moses to remind the people that they have to be generous. They have to be generous to the strangers within their gates. And he says in verse 22, when you reap the harvest of your land, and you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleaning from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Remember, they were strangers in the land of Egypt, and God provided for them so much. And so it's a principle for his people that they are not supposed to treat badly the strangers or the sojourners in their land. So we finished that feast. Now we're heading over to the fifth feast, which is the Feast of Trumpets. And we also know it as Rosh Hashanah. And it is celebrated in the fall, in the 7th month, on the 4th day of the month. This is the month of Tishri on the Jewish calendar, and God called for a special day of Sabbath rest and a blowing of the trumpets. So during this feast of the trumpets, there's special rest and the trumpets are blown. The people gather together for a holy convocation, and then an offering is made by fire to the Lord. That brings us to our 6th feast, which is the Day of Atonement, also known now as Yom Kippur. And I took some time in the last video to actually go through what happens on the Day of Atonement, because this is the holiest day in their entire calendar. It is sacred, it is solemn, it is less about the rejoicing and more about atonement and the covering of the sins. There's a gratitude behind it, yes, but there is also a holy solemnity that they have sinned against God, and God has made a way for them to be forgiven, and it is through the shedding of blood. So they're not celebrating as so much as they are afflicting their souls. They're humbling their souls as they recognize what sin does to them, what rebellion against God does, and how they need to be atoned for their sins. And it's very clear that any person who does not abide by this and does not rest on this day, doesn't afflict their souls, they will be cut off from their people. God wants his people to use this day for repentance, for humility, for reflection, to cease from their work and to focus on him. And that brings us to the seventh feast. Now, this is the Feast of Tabernacles, okay, also known as Sukkot. Now, on this 50th day of the 7th month, they have this feast. And this feast lasted for 7 days and one additional day. On the first day and on the 8th day, there was a day of rest. The whole idea of Sabbath is so important to God. There's a holy convocation. The people come together. And of course, there are offerings. There's the burnt offering, grain offering, drink offerings. Now, during this week, this is also a time for the people to bring their personal gifts to the Lord, their free will offerings, any vows that they have made, to pay those vows. And it says that they are going to rejoice before the Lord their God for 7 days. So we're seeing that in this feast, they are commanded to rejoice. This is not the atonement and the day to afflict the souls and humble themselves before the Lord. This is a day to rejoice. It's a week to rejoice as they happily celebrate God's goodness and provision. Another thing that he says that they will do when they observe this feast in the promised land is that each family is going to dwell outside of their homes in tents made of basically branches of palm trees, right? And they are to camp outside for this week as a reminder that they lived this way when they were in the wilderness, that they had hardships in the wilderness. So when they are in their promised land, they have beautiful homes and the beautiful land and the milk and the honey. There is this week that they will be rejoicing, yes, and they will also be living in tents outside to remind them of God's goodness and how God has brought them there and God has kept them even through the difficulties of the wilderness and even to this place. So as I said before, there's Sabbath rest on the first day, on the 8th day, and listen, they are just rejoicing, they're celebrating, they're refreshing themselves and enjoying being the people of God. So we're seeing that in these feasts, the first 4 were grouped together and the third ones were grouped together. So the separation of time between these 2 groups of feasts. Now, if you get a chance to do some research on this and the parallels between the feast and what Jesus Christ has come to do, there are some amazing similarities. There are some significant things to note, even with the time between the feasts and what each one represented. We don't have that much time to go into it here right now, but I will say this, that we know that Jesus is the Passover lamb. He is the one whom God has sacrificed, and when his blood is applied to our lives, the wrath of God, the punishment of God passes over us. And so that's just one of the parallels. Through all the different feasts, we're able to see it, because everything that God instituted in the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, was really just a foreshadow what Jesus would come to do. God's standard was so high because he demanded perfection, and he gave them a system with the Day of Atonement of how to be covered for another year, knowing that there would be a perfect, sinless lamb that would come, and with the shedding of his blood, we would be completely forgiven. So do some reading with that. It's really, really interesting. And And as I said, it gives you a new appreciation of how God has woven together the two parts of the scriptures, the books that we have, and the patterns that we see. That brings us to chapter 24. Okay, we got 24, 25, 26, 27, so we're almost there, all right? Chapter 24 talks about, in the first part, the care for the tabernacle with the lamps, how God wants the oil to be in the lamps at all times so that the lamps are burning continually. Remember, within the tabernacle, there were no windows, just veils and curtains to cover the entrances, so it was dark inside. And he ensured that there was always light burning before the Lord continually. And Aaron was responsible of tending this lamp stand and making sure that throughout the night the light or the fire would not go out. Similarly, the bread that's on the table of showbread must be changed weekly. There's a certain way it's organized, 2 stacks of bread with 6 in each stack, so it represents the 12 tribes of Israel. And also the frankincense that has to be on it, and it has to be fresh and every Sabbath changed, so that there's a continual memorial before the Lord of this offering. Then further in the chapter, it talks about the penalty for blasphemy. Let me read to you from verse 10. Now the son of an Israelite woman, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the children of Israel. And this Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel fought each other in the camp. And the Israelite woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed. And so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri of the tribe of Dan. Then they put him in custody that the mind of the Lord might be shown to them. So here's the situation. There is a woman of Israel who had a child with a man who was an Egyptian. If you remember back in Exodus, when the Israelites left Egypt through the Exodus, it says that a mixed multitude came out with them. So there were some Egyptians or half Egyptians among them. Here we have such a person, and he is fighting with another person who is an Israelite. And in the midst of the altercation, that the son, who was half Israelite, half Egyptian, that he blasphemed the name of the Lord and he cursed. So he cursed the name of the Lord. Now, to the people of Israel, the name of the Lord is holy. It is sanctified, and they don't even mention it. They don't even use it. They'll say Adonai for Lord. They are very reverent of the name of the Lord. And so he blasphemed the name of the Lord, and they brought him to Moses to find out what to do. As we go through it, we'll see what the penalty for verbally abusing God is. This will not be taken lightly. The penalty is execution by stones. The men who heard him say what he said were to go out of the camp with him, put their hands on their head to symbolize that they are the witnesses to what he said, and that he is to be stoned to death. And then he continues in the chapter talking about anyone who kills a person, they will be put to death. If anybody kills an animal without permission, they weren't put to death, but restitution was required. Okay, so God saw the value and the dignity not only of human life, but also of animal life. Yet the animal's life was not on the same level and value as the human's life. So that's why there was not a death penalty. So that wraps up chapter 24, and it brings us over into chapter 25. And chapter 25 starts off with the Sabbath of the 7th year, and we're going to learn more about Jubilee and what that means for the Israelite people. So I'm going to read to you from verses 1 through 7. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the Lord. And the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you, your male and female servants, your hired man, and the stranger who dwells with you. For your livestock and the beasts that are in the field, all its produce shall be for food. Okay, so once again, God's reminding them, listen, you're coming to the land, which I give you, all right? And when you get there, this is what you're going to do. He's saying that there is going to be a rest year, a Sabbath year on the 7th year for the land. Just as the people are to rest on the 7th day of every week, so too the land is supposed to rest in its 7th year. And I mean, I could just imagine the type of fruit and produce and vegetables that they would get. This is such a great agricultural principle to allow the land to rest. And so I'm sure that their increase of their field would have been phenomenal afterwards, right? So God gave this law, and also too, it's just a reminder to the people that they are to depend on God for everything. Nothing that they have or that they do is to be put above God and their reverence and their worship of God. And so they're headed to the new land, and God is giving them guidelines of how to treat the land when they get there. Another thing that is important to note is that God considers the land his. And so even in the time of Sabbath rest for the land, it is in the mindset that, hey, all this belongs to God. We do not own it. It belongs to God. And so we will obey his command. They would be dependent on God to provide for them, especially when they were not allowed to go out and sow and reap and harvest and all of those things. They had to live by faith, and that hasn't changed, right? The Bible tells us the just shall live by faith. We got to live by faith, trusting God that he will do what he says he will do. So that brings us to the Year of Jubilee. Right, so the Year of Jubilee was basically like a double Sabbath. So now we have every 7th year that the land will rest. But in this time, the crops were not planted, and so the land was given a rest for 2 years. So that's kind of like a double Sabbath, but there's a lot that happens with the Year of Jubilees. Not just for the land, it's also for the people. So let's read a little bit more, right? So when Jubilee was announced in the land of Israel, yes, it was a double Sabbath for the land, but also all peoples who were slaves were announced to be free. On the Day of Atonement, when the trumpet is sounded, that is a proclamation that Jubilee has begun. So the land receives an extra year of rest, like I just said, double Sabbath. And also, all land was to be returned to the family it was originally given to. So when the Israelites come into Canaan, there's going to be an allotment of land for the different tribes, right? And then within the different allotments, the different families would have portions of that land. So every tribe would have specific land that belonged to them. In the Year of Jubilee, if any land was sold or given away, it returns to the family it was originally given to. And all people, slaves, servants, all that were expected to return home. So everybody was set free. And the underlying principle with this is that the land of Israel belonged to God, so it could never be permanently sold or could never be permanently given away. Basically, the tribes, the families, they are only leasing the land. And this Year of Jubilee is a reminder that, hey, everybody's going back to the rightful place because ultimately it all belongs to God. And economically, it actually helped the nation because if you went through a hardship in a season and you became poor, had to sell your land, wherever it may be, listen, Jubilee is coming in some years. And so there's a reset. Everybody is brought back to the land that they own. If they had sold themselves into service because of debts, they were released. So everybody's debts were canceled. The servants were liberated. And listen, land was returned. So now I want to read to you from verse 18. So you shall observe my statutes and keep my judgments and perform them, and you will dwell in the land in safety. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell there in safety. And if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce? Then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. And you shall sow in the 8th year, and eat old produce until the 9th year. Until its produce comes in, you shall eat of the old harvest. Okay, you know what I love about this is that God lets them know beforehand what is going to happen. He doesn't leave it a chance or leave it up to their imagination. Well, okay, Sabbath, so what are we going to do? What's going to happen? He's letting them know what he has already put in place for them. So now that they have the year of Jubilee, so it's basically a double Sabbath, they can think, what are we going to eat? How are we going to make it as a family? And so he says to them that I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year. So in the 6th year, they will be so abundantly blessed that whatever they harvest in the 6th year will feed them in the 6th year, in the 7th year, which is the year of the first Sabbath, the year of rest, and then in the Jubilee, which gets a double Sabbath, so the 6th year, the 7th year, and the 8th year, they shall eat from the produce of the 6th year. And then in the 8th year, they sow and they eat in the 9th. And God's given them such abundant produce, and miraculously it's not going to rot and wilt and all those things, that they'll be able to eat of it until the time comes for the new harvest 3 years later. And so I think that is remarkable, and it just shows you how much God is invested in the life and the health and the prosperity of his people. Going on in this chapter, it also speaks about the redemption of property. So verse 23, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the land of your possession, you shall grant redemption of the land. So there you go. We're seeing once again that the Jubilee brings freedom, that the land ultimately belongs to God. They are strangers or sojourners, so it cannot be sold permanently. And God gives the parameters in which land can be redeemed. And in this redemption, you will see that there's a close family member who is able to come and redeem the land if a family member had to sell it because of a debt or anything else like that. And this idea of a kinsman redeemer, we will see it fleshed out a little bit more later on, and also in Jesus, who is our kinsman redeemer. In the chapter, there's also a reminder of care for the poor. Throughout all the chapters, we're seeing care and attention given to those who are less fortunate, and God wants to make sure that they are taken care of. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him, like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. So those who have misfortunes should not be at the mercy of other people. They cannot be treated badly, or other people cannot make money off of those who are experiencing challenges. We see his kindness here, we see his generosity, we see his heart towards his people, and he wants them to get it, okay? To get the principle, to live by the principle, because he is faithful, and he's been faithful to them all the way. Also with this, any person who is an Israelite who sells himself, because like I said, a debt or some challenge, there is an option for them to be redeemed. They can be purchased once again out of servitude, out of slavery, and there was a price that was set. It was connected to when the Year of Jubilee was happening, and it lets them know that they would not have to encounter challenges forever.